right, well, we're going to move into our third panel discussion, the topic of genetic research with Indigenous communities, current challenges, and future directions. First up, we'll have Kim TallBear speaking on anthropology, genomics, and whiteness.
I have a slight change of title because I focus on all of the sciences as well as the humanities and social sciences and upholding narratives of whiteness and the power of whiteness to define. In May 2013, Ian Mosby published an article in Social History, some of you in this room will have heard of this, that detailed shocking mid-20th century nutrition experiments conducted on First Nations people in northern Manitoba and in 6 residential schools across Canada. Aboriginal people chronically malnourished, some of them almost, this is a quote, starved and plainly not getting enough food to enable them to much more than keep alive, were already victims of a colonial state that had disrupted traditional lifeways and then subsequently deprived peoples of adequate government support, which would be necessary when the very basis of one's material life, one's ability to live off the land, is cut from beneath one's feet. On top of the considerable hardships already suffered by Aboriginal peoples, they were then used as a living human laboratory for nutrition scientists to pursue lines of inquiry about which they were curious. Scientists' research questions included, number 1, was the shiftless, indolent, inert Indian really simply a malnourished subject? Number 2, were foods supplied by traders after the Indian was removed from his or her land inadequate in light of modern nutritional knowledge? Mosby's revelation of this type of knowledge production is but the latest revelation of techno-scientific research done on Indigenous and other marginalized peoples from the standpoint of a colonial state that shapes and dictates standards of knowledge production that have largely gone unquestioned by mainstream scientists until relatively recently. The fundamental assumptions that undergird such research are that white folks, usually heterosexual men, do the research, and Indians, other people of color, women, the disabled, the perverse, get gazed upon, poked, prodded, bled, measured, photographed, and written about. Techno-scientific knowledge production, indeed also the knowledge production of the social sciences and humanities, is so clearly shaped by the eclipsed intellectual priorities of a Western mind that has for so long othered Indigenous peoples. Mosby also points out that colonial research, in addition to sometimes committing egregious ethical violations by post-World War II bioethical standards, for example, not intervening in a subject's near starvation conditions, always also does little to alter structural conditions. For example, the conditions of colonialism that led to malnutrition and hunger in the first place in Canada. Or another example, the structural conditions that make possible yet another ongoing and arguably colonial research project, the incessant examination of Indigenous populations and bodies marked by type 2 diabetes. Like the starvation and malnutrition of mid-20th century Aboriginal peoples, type 2 diabetes is a condition prompted in no small part by the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from our traditional lands and lifeways. And yet, 21st century biomedical researchers are on the hunt for a genetic trigger, further marking Aboriginal bodies as deviant, as a source of the problem, while the material deprivation that results from the state's colonial extraction of land and resources is not a question addressed by well-funded researchers whose narratives of genetic difference and the deficiency they imply prompt knowledge and funding priorities in certain directions and not others. Such research, Mosby notes, does more to bolster the career ambitions of researchers than to improve the health of those identified as being malnourished. And this is a chief concern that I have. How often biomedical research priorities build the capacity of non-Indigenous thinkers and institutions on the backs of Indigenous peoples without building our own capacity. This, I would say, is the central condition of 21st century ongoing colonial research. In 1996, a Washington college student tried to sneak into a hydroplane race on the Columbia River and stumbled upon one of the most complete ancient human skeletons ever discovered. In June of this year, it was announced in Nature that the 85-year-old 8,500-year-old so-called Kennewick Man is most closely related to today's Native Americans. Now, to the tribes in Washington state, as we heard earlier, the announcement of their kinship with the Ancient One, as they call him, came as no surprise. Since the remains were discovered, the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, Umatilla, and others have claimed the Ancient One as their ancestor. The skeleton, they argue, should be returned to them for reburial in accordance with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Vocal scientists protested. They speculated that there aren't sufficiently local genetic samples to link the Ancient One to living tribes. In 2004, a judge ruled that the Ancient One failed NAGPRA's cultural affiliation requirement. A shared group identity must be traced from the skeleton to present-day members of the tribe through geography, kinship, language, folklore, and more. It's difficult to prove cultural affiliation with a 9,000-year-old skeleton. Some might think that proving genetic affiliation, if technical conditions are right, is more straightforward, less political. But proving genetic affiliation is both technically and politically complicated, as we're hearing today. While new research methods might promise to validate Native Americans' ancestry by using science to legitimize our claims, we also risk ceding control of tribal identity to research institutions and their interests. So Indigenous people have good historical reasons to be wary of researcher agendas. Scientific treatment of Native Americans' DNA has been troubled and sometimes exploitative. It can clash with Indigenous definitions of kinship and identity, and it echoes science's long history of using the remains not only of Indigenous people, but also other people of color to prop up the notion that race is biological in ways that can reinforce society's racist notions and practices. The longstanding tension between scientists and Indigenous people came to a new and subtle head in the fight for Kennewick Man. The two possible outcomes, that the Colville tribe's jurisdiction will be challenged by scientists or that NAGPRA regulators will rule in the tribe's favor, both of these outcomes involve the power of white people and white-controlled institutions and entities to delineate and police Native American identity. I've also seen this fight play out from a more personal vantage point. This is my four-greats-grandfather, Chief Little Crow, or Te Oyate Duta, as we call him in our language. He was murdered in 1863 by a settler in Hutchinson, Minnesota. His remains, or what were left of them after he was scalped and his body dragged through the streets and then decapitated, were put on display in the Minnesota State Capitol and later stored in a state archive. So my great-grandfather and his uncle then petitioned that archive for a decade, and this is long before NAGPRA, before the remains were released to my family for reburial in 1971 in Flandreau, South Dakota, where I grew up and where many of Little Crow's descendants now live. So that's my mom and my daughter standing next to his grave, which, as you can tell, my family takes really good care of. So as an academic, I work with scientists who take various positions on the rights of Indigenous peoples to remains, including some who would have kept my ancestors' bones stored in an archive controlled by the colonial state. Now, scientists weren't quick to identify the Ancient One's Native American roots. The forensic scientists who first examined him assumed they belonged to a Euro-American settler, but carbon dating soon revealed them to be much older. The scientists who protested believed that the skull was different from contemporary Native Americans, perhaps more closely resembling those of Polynesians or Ainu, the Indigenous people in what are today Japan. The Ancient One's genome was finally sequenced by the lab of ancient DNA expert Eski Willerslev. Last year, his team also published the first full sequence of an ancient Native American genome, and you've heard about this already, based on the 12,000-year-old remains of a small child unearthed of the property of Montana's Anzac family. By comparing the genomes of Anzac Child and Kennewick Man, the team showed that both persons are descended from the same ancestral population. Then when they compared the ancient genomes with those of contemporary Native Americans, Willerslev's lab found that Kennewick Man is more closely affiliated with contemporary tribes in the Pacific Northwest, including the Colville, while Anzac Child is more closely related with present-day Indigenous populations in Central and South America. Now, Willerslev's lab got favorable press for approaching U.S. tribes to ask for their participation in the study, including giving biological samples, although only Colville agreed to that part. For some Indigenous people, these requests present a conundrum. If more tribes agree to participate, including giving biological samples, then more local DNA will be available for comparison, and the Kennewick Man's relationships to specific North American tribes might then be clarified. But some Indigenous people, of course, are still hesitant to participate after centuries of mistreatment. So my question is, again, whose interests are served by research on Native American bodies? European and American natural scientists have been violating Native American graves for hundreds of years. In centuries past, scientists paid grave robbers to boil down stolen bodies to bone, to send them to American universities for examination and sometimes for public display. Indigenous peoples globally continue to battle with universities and museums to retrieve their remains. And then subtler exploitation persists. Since the mid-1990s, organizations such as IPCB, or the Indigenous Peoples Council on Biocolonialism, have deemed genomic research a form of colonization. Scientists exploit Indigenous DNA for the intellectual and economic benefit of research institutions and, for some types of research, pharmaceutical companies, but not generally for the benefit of the individuals being studied. In another famous case, the Havasupai tribe, who live in the Grand Canyon, allowed Arizona State University scientists to collect blood samples in the hopes of finding medical insights into diabetes. The disease had reached epidemic proportions in that tribal population. University scientists also attempted to do schizophrenia research, or at least apply for money for that, which the tribe says they expressly forbade. Researchers also later used samples in studies on human migration and genetic isolation or inbreeding. Instead of improving the health of tribal members and their descendants, these later studies contradicted the tribe's origin narratives and stood to damage its reputation. ASU eventually paid the tribe a $700,000 settlement. Why should Native Americans help prove linear, no doubt overly simplistic theories of human migration that may also be used to cast suspicion on our claims to our ancestral lands? We have our own accounts of our histories and peoplehood, that we emerged as peoples in intimate relation with these homelands and with non-human relations in those places. Now, some people read these as creation stories. I read them as complex representations of human and non-human relatedness in place, and I really appreciated Cressida's focus on the agency of place. This isn't only about human bodies. This is about non-humans, and Indigenous people have not forgot our relationship and our dues that we owe to our non-human relatives. That's another problem I have with all of this genetic research. It's too human-centric. Some of us are also interested, especially if the research is done in a mutually respectful manner, in the roles of anthropological and genetic data in those histories. But scientific language that portrays us as just another set of immigrants, and ontological bullying by scientists like Therese Markow, who say that knowledge is power. Whose knowledge is power? She didn't mean our knowledge. That's something clearly generated by a science conditioned by centuries of white privilege. The biological sciences have been wary of the term race ever since the horrors committed in Nazi Germany under the pretense of racial science. So today, scientists instead talk about population and ancestry. Genomics in particular frequently reveals how genetically similar people of different races actually are. But science shares with the law and with white institutions in general the power to define and ultimately police race. Genomics shapes popular thought and will inform U.S. policy that confers legitimacy on Native American claims to remains, cultural property, land, and tribal status. It already reinforces Western culture's emphasis on lineal biological descent when it comes to questions of family, heritage, and identity. Genetic mothers and fathers, mitochondrial DNA inherited from biological mothers, Y chromosomes inherited from biological fathers, and autosomal DNA inherited from both are tied to particular geographies and populations, then those are grouped under these racial labels, Native American, African DNA, etc. Genomics does not and may not be able to address more expansive Indigenous definitions of belonging. For Native Americans, culture and biology are often entangled, but we also emphasize political status as a tribal citizen. Political belonging, non-human relatives, and land are key to our identities altogether. We also have controversial tribal blood rules that tribal communities have wrestled with throughout the 20th century, and we still do. I write and speak elsewhere on that, on the historical, also in part colonial imposed race-based politics of blood, but I won't do that here. And then there are ways of belonging that are not captured by tribal citizenship. We also have kin who do not meet our membership requirements, but who live as family within our communities. Tribal belonging is a political category, and it is also an extended set of biological and cultural relations simultaneously. Each tribe works out its own rules according to its own evolving laws and cultural norms. Willerslebb's lab in this instance produced results consistent with tribal viewpoints. But what happens when those accounts don't line up? Why should scientists, mostly white folks in lab coats, get the final word on who is our kin and how our histories are told? Inherent to whiteness is the power to define race categories and to regulate racial practices. White US lawmakers codified slavery, anti-miscegenation, segregation, land tenure rights. They define the white-black race line, which mandates that a person classified as black, if they have one black grandparent or great-grandparent, there we are. So if Barack Obama, I didn't switch slides here, lovely picture of our president, not my president anymore. Barack Obama has a white mother but can't be seen as white in a land with the one-drop rule. The shifting goalpost for whiteness ensured that the maximum number of black people could be enslaved for the economic benefit of white people, and it excluded blacks from full citizenship and humanity. Social contact, real or imagined, and attempts to pass as white have historically come at great personal risk to blacks living in both state and rogue white enforcement of the race hierarchy. Former Spokane NAACP official Rachel Dolezal's prerogative to self-identify as black, despite having two white parents, might be the apotheosis of the white privilege to define and change the categories we live by. Native Americans have also had our tribal identities enforced by white people. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, federal lawmakers decided which Indians had become white enough and assimilated enough to be designated as private landowners. Unsurprisingly, these categorizations were then used to shrink the number of Indians and collectively held tribal land bases that freed up a lot of excess land for white settlers to claim. At the same time, white governmental agents had strong ideas about who was sufficiently Indian to constitute a tribal member. The first tribal registers delineating who is and is not Native American were developed for the sake of white people's land management. Today, the US government and its anthropological, legal, and historical advisors ultimately decide the standards of ethnic and historical authenticity of tribes before federally recognizing them. Anthropologist Circe Sturm has documented hundreds of cases of playing Indian in her book, Becoming Indian. So like the Dolezal case, we're plagued with whites who play Indian in order to speak with moral authority, to sometimes practice ceremonies and to take advantage of scholarship and job opportunities they might not otherwise have access to. So I refer people to Sturm's book, Becoming Indian, a lot. It's been underrated. This is picture on the right is of Andrea Smith of the University of California, Riverside, who was publicly outed in Indian Country Today, The Daily Beast, Inside Higher Ed, and many other publications this summer for falsely claiming Cherokee identity. Rachel Dolezal also actually claimed to be part Native American, and that she was raised for part of her childhood in a teepee and hunted with bows and arrows. That claim was hardly noticed outside of Indian Twitter. While black and white is defined as mutually exclusive in the US, whiteness has been defined as capable of absorbing red. This is an inheritance from 19th century theories of cultural evolution in anthropology. So Dolezal's wild Indian child claims were much less problematic, apparently, in the court of public opinion than were her claims to be black. Many in academia have asked me why these cases matter and why I talk about them. Don't we have more important things to worry about? But I obviously see them as produced from the same histories of white privilege to name and define. 2 minutes? Okay. So how can science become less white privileged? You're going to hear all about this in the next two talks, I think. Not all scientists are white, but they potentially access that privilege of whiteness when they don that symbolic white coat. Despite anti-racist aspirations, genomics potentially compounds the power of white-controlled institutions to police non-white identity. It's part of an enduring Eurocentric monopoly on what counts as knowledge and history. Science and its sustaining ideology that Western civilization and truth exist in opposition to non-Western backwardsness and superstition is another manifestation of white privilege. And again, people of color are perfectly capable of taking that up. I've seen it. at health disparities meetings at National Institutes of Health, for example. Reports then about Eski Willerslev's lab can sound to the public like science has begun to make benevolent, politically correct concessions on behalf of superstitious Indigenous people, but I see science finally being held accountable to the humans, both living and dead, that it uses. It's becoming more ethical and it's becoming more democratic in some corners, thanks to the ongoing efforts of Indigenous peoples who have pushed the envelope, who have pushed back, and others who have worked in alliance with us, many of you in this room. And I just wanted to say, I've learned that there are two ways to elevate the rights and perspectives of Indigenous people in global scientific conversations. The first is to train scientists to do ethical and democratic research collaboratively with Native peoples. And the second is to train scientists who are themselves Indigenous, and maybe we can talk more about that later. And then I just want to end on I meant to go back. This is an excerpt from the Idle No More strategy. And I just highlighted in yellow the areas where I think scientists need to get involved. In this world, you cannot labor under the idea that you can be distanced and uninvested in politics. And so I have actually had scientists come up to me and say, what can we do? Well, read the Idle No More strategy. There's a lot of room in there to get involved in advising environmental movements, Indigenous people who are linking the violation of Indigenous treaties to the violation of the earth. There's a lot of room for science in there, and we need scientific advising and we need scientific literacy in order to effect change in this world. Thank you.